You just got a message that made your blood pressure rise. You started typing before you finished reading it. You already know what you're going to say. And that response, written in 30 seconds of pure reaction, might cost you something you can't get back. Now imagine a world where that impulse was trained out of you before you were 10 years old. In ancient Sparta, there was a principle so deeply embedded in their culture that it shaped everything: how they trained, how they fought, and how they communicated. It wasn't a rule, it was a philosophy of restraint. They called it laconism. And at its core was a belief most people today have forgotten. Silence is not weakness. Silence is precision, and precision is power. This isn't a video about ancient history. It's about something you do every single day. The way you use your words, your reactions, your attention, and what it costs you when you use them without thinking. Think about the last time you were in a real argument, the kind where your heart rate went up, where you stopped listening and started waiting for your turn to speak, where the goal shifted from understanding to winning. Now think about how it started, probably with something small, a comment, a tone, a single sentence that felt like a provocation. And before you had time to process what was actually happening, you were already inside it, fully reactive, burning energy on something that 24 hours later would feel almost meaningless. This is not a personal failure. It's biology inside an environment that was never designed to help you. We live in a world built on reaction. Social media doesn't reward considered responses. It rewards speed, emotion, and heat. The algorithm doesn't care if you said something accurate. It cares if you said something fast and loud. And we've been shaped by that environment more than most people want to admit. Studies in behavioral psychology show that the average person now spends over 6 hours a day in front of screens, a significant portion consuming content specifically designed to trigger emotional responses, not to inform, to activate. There is an entire industry built around keeping your nervous system in low-level stimulation. Because a stimulated person keeps scrolling, keeps reacting, keeps coming back. In that environment, deliberate silence has become almost foreign. We've been taught, implicitly, constantly, that silence means you have nothing to say, that not responding means you lost. We've inverted the meaning of restraint entirely. Reaction has become the default proof of strength. But there was a civilization that understood something different, and they built that understanding into the bones of every person they trained. The word laconic comes from Laconia, the region of ancient Greece where Sparta was located. The Spartans were so consistently known for their brief, precise use of language that their name became the definition of the style itself. According to Plutarch, in his work on the life of Lycurgus, verbal restraint was not considered a personality trait in Sparta. It was a discipline, taught, tested, and expected. In the Agage, the state-run education system beginning around age 7, training was not limited to physical endurance. It extended to how boys spoke, when they spoke, and whether they needed to speak at all. Plutarch describes the Agage as a system designed to produce not eloquent men, but controlled ones. Boys were observed for signs of emotional reactivity, not just anger, but nervousness, the eagerness to be heard, the need to explain themselves. These were interpreted as indicators of internal instability. A Spartan who reacted visibly had revealed something about his self-mastery, and what it revealed was a gap. The historical record contains exchanges that illustrate this principle. When Philip II of Macedon sent a message warning that if he entered Laconia he would destroy it, the Spartan response, according to various ancient sources, was a single word: if. No elaboration, no threat, no defensive posturing. Just one word communicating an entire psychological position. We are not afraid. We are not moved. Historians note that some of these accounts may have been sharpened over time into their cleanest form, but what matters is not whether every exchange happened exactly as described. What matters is that they were recorded and repeated because they reflected something real about Spartan culture. The deliberate cultivation of verbal economy as a form of power. Xenophon, who had direct contact with Spartan society, wrote about their discipline in terms that distinguished it sharply from Athenian norms. Where Athens celebrated rhetoric and extended argument as civic virtues, Sparta treated verbose speech with suspicion. To speak at length was to need something: validation, persuasion, reassurance. And needing any of those things was, in the Spartan framework, a form of dependence. It's worth being honest. Sparta was not a society worth romanticizing entirely. The agoge involved real suffering, and the system relied on the oppression of the Helot population. The goal is not to idealize what they built. It's to examine one specific principle they understood, and that we have largely lost. Language is energy, and energy spent carelessly is energy surrendered. Modern neuroscience has a name for what happens when we react before we think. Psychologist Daniel Goleman called it amygdala hijacking. The amygdala is the part of the brain associated with threat detection. When it perceives a social or emotional threat, a criticism, a provocation, an attack on status, it can trigger a response before the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, has time to process the situation. In that window between stimulus and response, the reaction happens. The message gets sent, the words get spoken, and then the rational brain catches up and has to deal with the consequences. This is not a character flaw. It is a design feature of a brain built for a different kind of threat. The amygdala evolved to help us survive predators. It was not built for social media comment sections or corporate email chains. But in the absence of real predators, it treats social threat with the same urgency as physical threat, and fires with the same speed. The Spartan practice of verbal restraint was, in neurological terms, a training protocol for extending that window. By repeatedly exposing young men to provocations and evaluating their response, the agoge was conditioning a longer delay between stimulus and reaction. Not suppression of emotion, extension of the processing gap. This aligns directly with what modern psychology calls emotional regulation. Research consistently shows that individuals who maintain a pause before responding demonstrate better decision-making, higher perceived authority, and more effective conflict resolution. The pause is not passive, it is active processing. If this is connecting with something you've been thinking about, subscribe to the channel. There's more coming, and it goes deeper. There's also something worth understanding about social dynamics. In group settings, human beings instinctively read reactivity as emotional instability. The person who responds quickly and with high effect to every provocation is unconsciously perceived as less stable and therefore less trustworthy. The person who waits, who responds with fewer words and more weight, is perceived as secure, not disengaged, grounded. The practical application is simpler than it sounds. Before responding to anything that produces an emotional charge, wait. Not forever. Just long enough to ask, is this a reaction or is this a response? Is this serving me or is this serving my ego? That distinction is where everything changes. Reaction is automatic, response is chosen, and chosen behavior, over time, becomes character. There's a historical note worth ending on, not as a triumph, but as a warning. After its greatest military period, Sparta began to change. Contact with wealthier cultures introduced customs the earlier system had deliberately excluded. The agoge softened. The principles that had defined Spartan identity for generations became ceremonial rather than lived. What had been a culture of discipline became a culture that remembered discipline, and Sparta declined. Not because its enemies became stronger, but because the internal framework that had made it coherent began to dissolve from within. Civilizations don't collapse only from the outside. They erode quietly, through the gradual replacement of principle with comfort. There's a personal version of that story too. The version where discipline becomes something you talk about instead of practice. Where silence becomes laziness instead of strategy. Where restraint becomes avoidance instead of strength. The line between the two is not always obvious, but it's always consequential. You don't need to live inside a Spartan system to understand what it was pointing at, but you do live in an environment that tests your self-governance every single day. Through screens, through noise, through the constant invitation to react, to perform, to fill every silence with proof that you exist. The question Sparta asked its young men was not whether they could fight. It was whether they could control what they did before the fight. Whether they could hear a provocation and choose not to answer it. Whether they could hold their position, not through aggression, but through stillness. The kind that communicates something more unsettling than a threat. That they didn't need to prove anything at all. That quality, the ability to not react, may be the most underestimated form of strength in the modern world. Not because it makes you passive, because it makes you deliberate. And deliberate people, in a reactive world, carry an advantage that most people never develop. The world doesn't need more noise. It needs people who know when to stop adding to it. Silence was a weapon in Sparta. In the world you live in now, it might be something even more rare. It might be the one thing you haven't tried yet.